That an absence on one side creates something on the other, and this is a very good example. I said it for a long time. If your entire media says that Islamic extremism has nothing to do with Islam, you will create a movement that says it's all to do with Islam, and all Muslims must be involved. In the same way as if you pretend that no migrant into Europe is ever going to be anything other than the most brilliant PhD student, you will create a movement that says they're all terrorists.
Douglas Murray once again plunges headfirst into a blazing debate, this time over whether the media's coverage of terrorists does more harm than good. Brace yourself as Murray unleashes his unrestrained and provocative insights, standing alone on the panel in his fierce defense of exposing terrorists through the media. But first, let's listen to today's host lay down the groundwork for the debate, followed by Douglas's opponents as they present their arguments.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very excited to be here this evening with such an incredible panel of distinguished guests, and I think we're going to have a really interesting conversation about what is undoubtedly an incredibly important topic. And this issue of how much attention and how much coverage to give terrorists and how much time to spend discussing terrorism is something that I think a lot of us have thought about. As being a journalist myself who has covered many terrorist attacks, it is something I have often grappled with. Are we part of the solution? Are we part of the problem? How much is too much? Certainly, it's something we can't ignore, but are we spending too much time on it? Or, as President Donald Trump has suggested, are we not covering it enough? So there are a lot of different viewpoints on this topic, and that's why we're so lucky to have this incredible panel. The official title of tonight's debate is "Don't Give Them What They Want. Terrorists Should Be Starved of the Oxygen of Publicity." Let me start now with you, Simon, if you would like to give your opening remarks.
I think if you believe that the terrorists should be starved of the oxygen of publicity, why are you here? My point of view, for what it's worth, is that I don't think terrorism is very important. And I think we make it important, and by making it important, we make it important. It does not matter very much. A terrorist incident is a happening. It's an accident. It affects the people directly affected by it. But terrorism does not threaten states. It doesn't threaten the integrity of America or Britain. They can't invade us. They can't do serious damage to our economy unless we let them. They cannot affect our values, our democracy, anything like that, unless we let them. They are, to all intents and purposes, useless criminals. They simply blow things up and kill people. The only point at which they threaten us is by our reaction to them. They have no standing whatsoever, other than in terms of our reaction to them. And our reaction to them is conditioned by the publicity we give them. They depend upon publicity. The multiplier of publicity is what makes the terrorism act terrorist. Otherwise, it's just a killing. That's why very few terrorist incidents occur in autocratic and dictatorial countries. They don't get any publicity. They get publicity where we give them publicity, and it's on that publicity that they feed. ISIS, interestingly, last week said they regard publicity as their nuclear weapon. It's the thing they rely upon to make their impact. We've become completely obsessed with them. Terrorism has been seized upon by the military defense establishment, effectively to boost their budgets. Terrorists should be dealt with by crime watchers, by police, by intelligence agents, and so on. They're not a source of aircraft carriers or bombers, all that sort of thing. We have gone far too far in reacting to them, and Donald Trump, who sooner or later will be mentioned this evening, illustrates that so well by saying we should give them more publicity. What a lunatic thing to do. I simply think that the best thing we can possibly do is you cannot not cover news. And I'm sure tonight we'll discuss what this really means. You can't not cover news. You then hand the terrorist over to the much more terrorist thing, which is the rumour. You mustn't allow rumour to dominate news. But we mustn't over-exaggerate the significance of a terrorist incident. The BBC spent 4 days on the Nice atrocity. Obama comes over to march in honour of the Hebdo massacres. It was an appalling way of glorifying this particular obscenity. I feel so strongly that the least we can do to publicise terrorists, the more we're likely to defeat them.
Simon's claim is absurd. To suggest that widespread issues are unimportant or inconsequential is blind ignorance. Consider the Syrians struggling in the face of unspeakable horrors daily. The Paris attacks devastated the economy, proving the impact of such threats. Ignoring these dangers and belittling their significance only strengthens them. Simon's stance is dangerous, naive, and indefensible, perpetuating the very risks he downplays.
I just have to ask you, though, you say terrorism doesn't threaten states. It may not affect or threaten directly Western states, but if you look at Middle Eastern states, or Iraq, for example, it seems that ISIS got pretty far in challenging their power.
ISIS is an insurgency. Terrorism is a mechanism, it's not an ideology. Terrorism is a form of attack. You try and kill people, you try and cause an atrocity in order to terrify someone, to change them, get them to change their mind or change their policy. ISIS is an insurgency, which is occupying territory now. That's a completely different matter from terrorism. They happen to use terrorist methods, but their essence is not terrorism. Their essence is the setting up of a caliphate. So, I come back to my point. There's no point in terrorism if you don't give it publicity.
Okay, Fawaz.
Well, I'm going to I agree to a great extent with Simon, but before I do so in the debate, I have 2 points in terms of contexts. The first point is that one of the lessons I have learned over really the last 20 years working on these groups, we call them social movements that use violence for political purposes. One of the lessons is that whether you're talking about Al-Qaeda or ISIS, they're waging 2 battles. One battle on the battlefield to carry out attacks, whether in Iraq or Syria or Libya or Egypt or Istanbul. And one battle is really for the hearts and mind, one battle to get publicity. They crave publicity. In fact, I would argue in the eyes of whether it was Osama bin Laden or Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the greater jihad is not to carry out attacks. The greater jihad is to get more publicity, The reason why publicity and coverage is very important because it's a force multiplier. And there are 3 reasons why publicity matters, coverage matters. First, they want to basically trigger fear. The institution of terrorism, as you've said, it's all about fear. It's about really creating fears, instilling fear, terrorizing the enemy, and also about inspiring and motivating the base. They want to motivate their base, whether it's in Iraq or Afghanistan, or even some of the deluded young men in Western societies. And they also as a potential recruitment technique. So when CNN and BBC and all of us go and talk about the attacks in Paris or Brussels, this is basically feeds into their narrative. They matter greatly. They have the capacity to terrorize Western societies. In fact, many of us now focus on ISIS as somehow ISIS has invented the so-called social media. Let's remember that it was Osama bin Laden who pioneered the strategy of really appealing to the media. He turned his humble cave in Afghanistan into a meeting room where basically world-class, reporters visited his cave in Afghanistan. Let's remember Peter Bergen of the CNN, Robert Fisk of The Independent, Abdel Bari Atwan, and many others. In fact, in the eyes of Osama bin Laden, the media was it. He wants to spread his message. He wants to basically get his message near and far, not only to Muslim audiences, but also to certain constituency in the West. So we need, when we talk about coverage regardless, that this plays into their own narrative. It matters a great deal. They crave publicity.
Simon's argument is short-sighted. While Europe may not face the same level of threat as Iraq, the devastation caused by ISIS cannot be ignored. Fawaz blindly supports Simon, claiming that terrorist actions like media manipulation are the greater jihad. This belittles the true impact of their violence. Their naive views strengthen those seeking to cause real harm, disregarding the brutal reality of terrorism.
The second point, in terms of context, I want to come back to Simon's point. What we need to take into account, again, if we take all the terrorist attacks that have taken place since the mid-1990s, terrorism does not represent a strategic threat. Terrorism basically represents a limited nuisance. It's so sad and tragic when you have the Prime Minister of Britain, David Cameron, saying ISIS represents an existential threat to the West. ISIS represents an existential threat to the West. Well, the hell with the West if ISIS really threatens the West.
Exactly.
Think about it. The same thing with, Donald Trump now. He criticized the American media for not covering, terrorism enough. Again, You have now Western leaders who are using terrorism as a political tool, and to come back to the argument that terrorism really represents a limited nuisance as opposed to a strategic threat. I mean, look what, since 9/11, the average annual between 2001 and 2015, we estimate that only 6 individuals have been killed in the United States and the United Kingdom in incidents related to Islamist terrorism. Annually, you're talking about 6 individuals who have been killed in the United States and the UK as a result of terrorist incident. We know that basically lightning in the United States kills 30 people annually. We know hundreds of people get killed as a result of deer causing incidents. In Ohio itself, 9 people die every day as a result of doses, high doses. Again, we need to keep, I'm not suggesting that terrorism is not insidious, is not dangerous. But what I'm trying to say is that too much publicity basically plays into the narrative of ISIS. Final point, I'm not suggesting we should not cover terrorism, because terrorism matters too. It's a newsworthy thing. It matters a great deal. It should be proportional. We should put it in perspective. We should have resilience. And the final point, by really, overplaying, inflating terrorism, we are terrorizing ourselves. This is really what this is.
So you're not advocating for sort of self-censorship, but you're saying that media coverage should be more responsible, more nuanced, and there should be less of it?
Absolutely, and we should tell the audience about, the effects of terrorism, the impact of terrorism, as opposed to, more than I do. How many days we have spent on the, terrorist attacks in Paris or Brussels. They were horrible, they were insidious, they were dangerous. But it was a kind of, playing into the narrative of ISIS and Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, giving them ammunition, providing them with the oxygen. This is their greatest jihad, because they appeal to the base. We are invincible. We are indefeatable. We are bleeding the West, terrorizing the West. In a way, it's the oxygen that sustains the narrative. And again, we are terrorizing our incidents.
Fawaz's stance is alarming. He minimizes terrorism as a limited nuisance and makes insensitive remarks about the West and ISIS. Claiming Western leaders exploit terrorism for political gain, he argues for reduced media coverage to avoid playing into terrorist narratives. This dangerously naive view dismisses the true severity of terrorism, emboldening terrorists and hindering counter-terrorism efforts. Such reckless opinions fail those impacted by terrorist atrocities.
Let me turn the table on its head and say we're talking about whether terrorism provides oxygen to groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Let me say that as a result of this obsession, in fact, our coverage and obsession with terrorism, we are providing oxygen to populist movement in Western societies. We are distorting domestic politics in the West. In fact, this obsession with these kind of limited threat is providing oxygen to hyper, far-right movements. And in many ways, it's really changing, dramatically transforming Western politics, not just playing into the narrative of ISIS and Al-Qaeda.
Fawaz concludes by claiming that giving terrorists publicity plays into their narrative and supposedly alters Western politics, fueling far-right movements, but is ignoring the real threat, any solution. His view is dangerously naive and dismisses terrorism's severe impact. Ignoring only empowers them, just as giving them too much attention does. Up next, Douglas shares unfiltered insights rejecting naive optimism for practicality.
Okay. Douglas, are you going to jump into the rescue of Western media? Oh.
Not likely. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm very glad this isn't a debate format, because I think this question is so complex, and I think most of us have such contrary views on this. It's a very good thing that it's not set up as an either-or thing. The first thing I would say, but I agree very much with what Fawaz just said about that Cameron point. I entirely agree. I thought it was an absurd, indeed obscene thing for a Prime Minister of the UK to say that ISIS is an existential threat when it's no such thing. However, I do have to push back a little on something that Simon has already said. Terrorism can do serious damage. And as everybody knows, just from that one thing that's already come up twice this evening, the attacks in Paris in November 2015, it still is doing damage. Still, the Parisian economy, the tourist economy is not recovered from that. It's still a city suffering from that. Now, I don't know how you could get into a situation where multiple suicide bombings go off in the nearest capital city to this one, where multiple suicide bombings go off at a football match, at a rock venue, drive-by shootings, Kalashnikov attacks in cafes and restaurants, and that wasn't reported, or it just was mentioned, and we all got on with our lives. The public want to know that information. We want to know, I'm going to go to Paris next weekend. Is it a wise idea? Is it good to go or not? Of course we need this information, and we need the media to be reporting it. And I have to say that we have to appreciate what the end point of Simon's point of view on this is. In 2013, when two British converts to Islam, two very radical young men, ran over in broad daylight in South London, in this city, ran over a soldier at home on leave from Afghanistan, drummer Lee Rigby, hacked at his body in the middle of the road, tried to get his head off with machetes, and so on. Simon described that as a mundane act of violence. Now, I don't think that is a mundane act. It was in your Guardian column at the time.
I'm sorry.
Anyhow.
It was a mundane act of violence.
But, you see, for most of us, the general public, we don't think that the reporting of a soldier being decapitated in broad daylight by two such men is a mundane thing. It is certainly an act of violence, but we have to be very careful. That is the end point of dismissing the terrorists, of saying we don't give them any oxygen. We try to get around it in some way. Now, I think, by the way, that the censorship around terrorism already exists to an enormous extent in our societies. The media in this country and in America and elsewhere don't show anything like explicit images of the aftermaths of terrorist attacks. And there is a very good argument that actually if the public saw what those of us who've covered and seen attacks have seen, that their views on this would be a lot harder than they currently are, and that the media actually holds this back from the public, and that as a result the public are less enraged than they would otherwise be by this.
Douglas contradicts Simon's idealistic view by citing real-life events like the 2015 Paris attacks. He criticizes Simon's claim that terrorism doesn't harm economies and highlights the lack of recognition for tragedies. Douglas condemns Simon for calling the butchering of Lee Rigby as a mundane act of violence in his Guardian column, which he so shamelessly laughs off. Is this how you honor your national heroes?
But, you know, if you support the motion tonight, how would you do it? How would you stop covering the terrorists when they carry out an attack in Paris for a night and kill 130 people and leave many more wounded for the rest of their lives? How would you do it? How would you do it in the age of the internet? Okay, it's plausible you could get a press regulatory body so rigorous that it stopped the remainder of the print press from publishing any information about it. People would go to the internet. How do you shut down the internet from covering this? Now, having said that, there's one very important point on this, which is that obviously the press have to show restraint. And I want to give you two very quick examples in my life of the press clearly not showing restraint on this. And this is where there will be some unanimity on the panel tonight. In 2004, when the British-born man Ken Bigley was held hostage in Iraq by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi's group, many of you will remember this. There was a drip feed of information on an hourly and daily basis by Zarqawi's group. And they knew, and we knew from the moment that American forces ended up getting into his compound, that his group were watching the British media like hawks, because Tony Blair was being personally held responsible by a man being held hostage with a knife to his throat. And if you remember, that man, Ken Bigley, was saying on camera, "I blame Tony Blair." And the British press were blaming Tony Blair. And there was a moment there where the combination of an extremist group and the British press effectively helping them could well have brought down a prime minister in a democratic society. It came very, very close at that point. And the second example I would give was 10 years after that, in 2014, when Jihadi John, as he was called, Mohammed Emwazi, another British citizen, was executing, murdering, beheading people in the Syrian desert. I would argue that was another time when the British press needed to show restraint, and a lot of it did. You'll remember that The Independent ran a front page saying that we are not showing the photo of this. That may have been an extreme example, but the British press, once again on that occasion, the international press, were being used by that group to have this drumbeat of terror. So on that, I think there'll be some agreement. I think that the British press, by and large, does show restraint. I don't think we can not cover the terrorists, but there are occasions when the press in this country and elsewhere has got it very badly wrong.
Douglas Murray debunks weak arguments, stressing the impracticality of ceasing terrorist attack coverage. In the digital era, social media would compensate for mainstream media's restraint, possibly spreading misinformation. Despite advocating for media discretion, Murray acknowledges instances like Ken Bigley's kidnapping, where media manipulation nearly destabilized a government. In such cases, he aligns partially with Simon and Fawaz on the need for media restraint.
Well, so let me ask you, you bring up Jihadi John, and I think this is an interesting one. Why give him a nickname like Jihadi John? Why not call him by his name, Mohammed al-Muazi?
Sure.
Why do we have to come up, the very idea of coming up with nicknames? And also I wanted to ask you about a distinction between covering ISIS propaganda and terrorist attacks. There's a big difference between running their videos of them with the black and white flag saying the Shahada and showing what happened in Paris, right?
Yes, there is. There's a very big difference between the two. And sometimes we fall into covering both as if they were the same thing. But as for that, the nickname point is a very good point. I'm slightly bemused by it myself. Of course, we didn't know his name was Mohammed al-Muazi when we knew that he existed and he was the decapitator. So he had to be given some term, I suppose. I do think that the sort of weird jokiness of it is...
The Beatles, I think, coined the term in the British press.
I don't know why people do it. Maybe it's a coping mechanism about something very grotesque and that you can sort of slightly laugh at it. I don't know. It doesn't seem very healthy to me. I've always thought that it familiarizes barbarism.
Douglas delivers his unvarnished perspectives on Jihadi John, dissecting the thin line between authentic news and propaganda. He astutely notes that conflating the two is a grave error. Regarding the moniker Jihadi John, Douglas condemns it as a maladaptive coping mechanism that normalizes savagery. The host then pivots to Simon, seeking his insights on censorship, and the journalist's pivotal role in the labyrinthine process of reporting.
So let me ask you, Simon, and we'll sort of have a bit more of a fluid chat now. But what you're essentially talking about amounts to self-censorship on a certain level. And I just wonder, does it confuse the role of the journalist at all? Because the journalist traditionally is not supposed to be a judge. The journalist is supposed to be someone who is a filter, who provides information to people who want to receive that information.
Well, let's go back to that point. What makes news? News of someone issuing a press release is boring. News of somebody saying, I think you're a bunch of infidels and I wish you'd change your minds and become Islamists, is boring. So they do something truly horrific because they know that horrific things make news. You then have a problem. That's what they want you to do. It's because some Chinese philosopher said, always ask what your enemy most wants you to do. We always answer terrorism with what they most want us to do. We fall straight into the trap of doing what they want.
But is it not our job?
Well, it's not our job to do their job for them. It really isn't our job. But what I do think is new, and this is, in a sense, the point where we might discuss it, is this is quite unlike other forms of news. This is a form of, when you're covering a war, you're covering a war. In this case, you are a part of the story, because that's what the other side wants you to be. And in becoming a part of the story, you are, as you said at the beginning, a part of the problem rather than the solution. And I just think, what I'm saying here is I think for newspapers, it is no good simply saying, we cover every story. Because in the first place, you have, as we've been saying, you have a decision to make about how intensively you cover it. Do you fly Hugh Edwards out to Nice, which is what the BBC did? That's exactly what I'm sure I said. Please, will you fly Hugh Edwards out to Nice? Thank you very much, BBC. You've done what you wanted to do. We wanted you to do. You have a decision to make as to how intensively you cover a story. But I go beyond that, really, and say you are now the story. You are a part of what the other side wants to happen. So, and you can't just simply say, it's like another story.
Simon argues that journalists worsen terrorism by giving it attention. He believes terrorists seek headlines with horrific acts. However, censoring news isn't the solution. Simon suggests reporting terrorism makes journalists part of the narrative, undermining the role of journalism in informing the public about real threats. Ignoring terror doesn't make it vanish, it blinds us to dangers. His approach is naive and risky.
Okay, Douglas, do you agree with that? Is there essentially a synchronicity going on, or a symbiosis between ISIS or groups like ISIS and the media? Are they kind of playing into each other somehow?
Yes, they are. I mean, we know the extent to which people, for instance, in ISIS use the internet to see what their coverage is like, that day. I mean, there are cases of this. So there's obviously a synchronicity. I think, by the way, the whole thing plays into a thing which, I mean, it's not just on this subject, but on any subject. What is the normal routine in the media now in the era of 24-hour news? Something happens, you need somebody to react to the something, then you need somebody to bring on the story. But every journalist, anyone who's ever worked in journalism will know this, you get a call from BBC, CNN or something. The Prime Minister said this about this happening. I wonder if you'd call for this. And you think, well, no, usually. Usually it's, in politics, it's somebody calls for somebody's resignation. That's another kick of the wheel. The story goes on a bit longer. Now there have been calls for the resignation of this person after this thing that's happened, and so on and so on. So there is a momentum to all news stories. Keep pushing it forward. And the reason why, I mean, personally, I don't watch if you don't mind me saying so, the 24-hour news after any terrorist attack, because something terrible has happened, and one doesn't learn very much about it by the presence of said, major reporter standing some miles away, from the scene. Or the best one, not to be too light-hearted about it, but it wasn't the terrorist attack. You'll remember that when that Russian submarine went down, Donetsk, some years ago, the BBC ended up renting a helicopter to fly over the sea to show a bit of sea. And then on air, it turned out that they weren't allowed to fly over the bit of sea which the submarine was under, because the Russian authorities had ordered a blockade over the airspace. So the BBC, just at enormous expense, had covered a bit of sea like the bit of sea.
Douglas notes the unsettling reality of media and terrorists fueling each other's agendas, citing real-life cases. He chooses to avoid news after tragedies, warning about unreliable information and the media's focus on figures. He criticizes BBC's sensationalism with helicopter coverage, revealing the media's pursuit of attention despite truth. This emphasizes the dangerous alliance between media and terrorism for sensationalism over accuracy.
Okay, yeah, fair enough. But Fawaz, don't you think there is a need? Because I think the point that we seem to be dancing around here a little bit is not that one shouldn't cover it or give them attention. It's about the kind of attention you're giving them. Absolutely. And instead of giving them catchy little nicknames, how about doing some real hard-hitting reporting that looks into ISIS as being a symptom of something and not necessarily a cause?
I think what we need to understand is that there is two wars. And the other war, the media war, really is strategic for both Al-Qaeda and ISIS. That everything they do in order to really, get attention. Everything they do is they want to instill fear and terrorize the public, whether you're talking about Iraq or Syria or Libya or Western societies. In many ways, we have to make decisions, how much coverage we give to the, certain particular attacks. Let's remember, again, I'm taking you away from, the media itself. That initially ISIS was not interested initially in carrying out attacks against the far enemy, against Western societies. In fact, ISIS differs dramatically from Al-Qaeda because the basic focus of ISIS is on the near enemy, whether you're talking about Iraq or whether you're talking about Syria or Libya or Egypt. The reason why ISIS has decided to attack Western target, because again, because it perceives basically the US-led alliance with France and the United Kingdom. So in this particular sense, we need to talk about why ISIS has decided to attack certain Western target. What has happened? What's the strategic mindset of both Al-Qaeda and ISIS? We're not doing this. And in many ways, if you follow, and in fact, ISIS is delighted by the coverage it's getting, whether you're talking about Brussels or Paris or Germany or other places.
So what's the alternative, though? I still don't really have a feel for what the alternative is.
I think we have to talk about these attacks. But think about it. I mean, you covered the attacks in Paris. I mean, non-stop for days, several days, every single television stations. I mean, the amount of coverage is overwhelming. It's just overwhelming. I mean, you covered it yourself. And this is exactly what ISIS wants you to do. You're basically playing into the narrative of ISIS, because ISIS basically is appealing to the base. ISIS is motivating, inspiring the base. And also ISIS is saying, well, look, we have capacity. We have capacity to strike at the heart of European societies. It's also as a recruitment technique. And we know, in fact, we have covered, after every attack, basically increased number of young men and women who tend to migrate to these particular groups, whether you're talking about Syria or Iraq or Libya.
The host confronts Fawaz on media coverage of terrorism, proposing deep reporting over sensationalism. The talk transitions to terrorists using the media for spreading fear. When asked for solutions, Fawaz evades, repeating tired arguments. His avoidance exposes his lack of real answers and dangerous naivety. The weakness of Fawaz's stance becomes evident with his reluctance to engage in meaningful discussion.
What do we do about it? Reasonable question.
Because we have a responsibility to our viewers and our readers too, and they do care about terrorism. They do think it's important.
I mean, care important?
Yeah, we can all sit here with our lofty ambitions and be like, oh, they don't understand, it's not strategically important. But they do feel it's important.
It's ghoulish. It is a particular sort of horror, deliberately designed to appeal to the ghoulish voyeurism in the viewer. That's what they're doing. Now, the question is, how do we respond to it? Now, it's a good, reasonable question. I think myself that it is, as I said before, it's quite unlike any other story. We're not just covering a story. We're covering a very particular sort of story, and I just think it's incumbent upon the media represented here to ask themselves, now, how do we exercise self-restraint? Because it is about restraint. I mean, at the moment, an American president is building his presidency on terrorism. It's ridiculous. How on earth do we draw back from the state of this obsessiveness? I think, for what it's worth, that the press regulatory bodies, such as they are, and the professional bodies, ought to be preparing protocols, conferences, discussions about how we react to terrorist incidents. They ought to be. I mean, most news organizations, I think probably including yours, do have a sort of protocol. I mean, Le Monde tried to restrain naming terrorists. A lot of press organizations have ways in which they do handle this, and they are moderately effective. But I can see a situation in which almost the government of the day says, not censorship, it says, look, you guys, you're really a part of the problem. You're a menace.
But it's a fine line, the censorship.
But you asked, of course the public apologies. Do you want to finish?
No, no.
I mean, the question is, to what extent does the coverage, the extensive, the overwhelming, the addictive coverage really produce certain public reactions? To what extent, in many ways, we are pouring gasoline on a raging fire? Just at the end, the last year of Barack Obama, the American public, we have surveys about this, the American public was, almost majorities opposed to any kind of American intervention, either in Iraq or Syria. And in the space of about 4 or 5 months, there was a marked, basically, difference in the reaction of the American public. A majority of Americans basically, the views changed dramatically as a result of the media coverage of the barbarities that basically taken place against Americans. Well, I don't know whether there was a causal link between how the media covered particular events and the change in the American attitudes about intervention, or whether somehow, the barbarities themselves brought about the change in the American.
Simon steps in to support Fawaz, criticizing the media's focus on terrorism, but is censorship an effective solution? He calls for media restraint to deny terrorist publicity. Fawaz notes media influence on public opinion. Shouldn't responsible reporting be the focus, avoiding fear-mongering? Their argument overlooks the press' vital role in promoting informed public discussion. Are they neglecting the importance of balanced, informative news coverage?
I think you raise an interesting point there, and I wonder, Douglas, if you could sort of expand on that a bit. Is there an argument to be made? We've heard President Donald Trump come out and say, we're not covering terrorism enough. And to all of us who work in news, I think we were like, you must be taking the piss, was probably the first reaction. Yeah. And then they provided this list of, various attacks in Europe, many of which, in fact, we hadn't covered because they were incidents where maybe one person was stabbed, and because the threshold is probably quite high at this stage for it to become leading a news broadcast. But
you didn't do enough on Sweden, did you?
But do you think there's an argument to be made on the other side that we're not covering it enough, that we're trying to sanitize it, that by not showing the images, as you said, that by not sort of, going over every single incident?
Well, can I, firstly, the press already, the media already does a fair amount of editorializing before you even get to the discussion we're having. Let me give you one example. ISIS, which is the subject of Fawaz's book.
Thank you.
If you'd like to hold it up again. No, I'm not. I've got a 10% deal on this. ISIS, now the main broadcaster here in the UK, the one that we all pay for, the one that is, I think, responsible for the fact that our media is not as divided as it is in, for instance, in America. There's much to be said for the BBC. The BBC chose to not use that term. It's so-called Islamic State, as the BBC. Well, that's an editorial decision it takes about the group. I've often said, if I keep on hearing the BBC called the so-called Islamic State more times, I'll put my so-called shoes through the so-called television. But it's an infuriating editorial decision, which nevertheless they've taken before you've even got to reporting the story. That's why you can speak to a lot of people in this country who, despite this, what we're talking about here as being an over-coverage, still have very little idea of what it is that ISIS wants. Because we actually don't have a lot of that discussion, because our broadcasters and our press don't want to have a lot of that discussion. And so we go round and round on the pornography of violence. I'd much rather we had those bigger and deeper discussions that meant that people knew what was actually going on with this group, what they actually want, and what groups like them want.
The host turns to Douglas, asking if it's time to focus more on each terrorist incident. Douglas passionately argues that media censorship dilutes the gravity of reporting on terrorism. Despite constant ISIS coverage, many don't understand their goals. Shouldn't we be informed? By shying away from tough conversations, media outlets prioritize sensationalism over depth, profiting from juicy news while neglecting critical issues.
But just very quickly, I've got to pick up as well on this mention about Sweden, if I may, because this actually does get to a core divide that's going on at the moment. I do not enjoy the bifurcation of American media, I have to say. I don't like the fact that increasingly these are two sides talking about each other, but never to each other. And I think it's enormously regrettable for democracy as a whole. That said, there is a specific problem which the Sweden story actually talks to. Now, as it happens, I've just finished the book, which Fawaz will be, by agreement, promoting any moment. No, which comes out in May. But it's about the migration crisis in Europe. And I've been spending quite a bit of time in Sweden, among other countries. And there are, now it's not terrorism on a daily basis, but there are so many societal problems that have broken out in Sweden in the last few years. And you very, very rarely see anything about it in the press and the media in this country or in America. And I think that what happened in this is emblematic of a problem. So the media doesn't cover the story. Okay, you could say, well, who cares about Sweden? Or it's just, it's just this. But the fact is that it's the non-coverage of that, of a very serious story, and then a sort of cack-handed reference to it by the American president that is responded to by the liberal media saying, ha, 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 it's so hilarious. Sweden's just this wonderful place where everyone's just doing IKEA stuff all the time, is a horrible, horrible deepening of the divide.
Douglas bravely confronts tough truths, steering the talk to Sweden. He stresses dialogue and unity over insults, focusing on Sweden's post-immigration violence surge. Media should cover non-terrorism issues, he says. Isn't it vital to address all societal problems, not just terrorism? Solely focusing on terrorism ignores vital issues like Sweden's challenges. Douglas calls for broader focus to tackle all pressing matters and foster meaningful discussions.
May I just, I'm glad you have mentioned Donald Trump, and what really worries me a great deal is not about whether we discuss, the phenomenon of terrorism. We should. I think the phenomenon of terrorism is going to be with us for the next 20, 30 years. It's byproduct of globalization. It's part of breakdown of societies in the Muslim world, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Syria. Really what we are seeing in the West here, basically the reverberations of the breakdown of the state system in many countries. This is just That's why I said it's nuisance. What alarms me a great deal is when I hear Donald Trump and other politicians in the heart of Europe collapsing terrorism with the refugees, collapsing terrorism with migration, collapsing terrorism with Islam. And then you have a big existential problem in our hands. This is really where Western politics now, this is the question, this is the challenge. How do you separate, how do you de-link the phenomenon of terrorism, which is dangerous, in a limited way, right? Limited way. I mean, I call them really organized networks criminality. Why do we treat terrorism different than the mafia? Why do we invest terrorism with existential cultural overtones? I mean, the overwhelming majority of Muslims, I mean, this cliché, have nothing to do with ISIS or Al-Qaeda. The overwhelming majority of victims are Muslims, whether in Iraq or Syria or Libya or Egypt or Afghanistan. But this is what we really are going round and round the question. To what extent does Donald Trump now use, and he has used the question of ISIS very effectively, politicians in the heart of Europe.
Fawaz challenges Douglas on Sweden's post-migration crime surge, rejecting the terrorism immigration narrative as absurd. But is this truly fiction? Statistics reveal a migrant crime correlation in various countries. In Sweden, immigrant crime rates surpass the national average, warranting valid concerns. Ignoring these facts hinders constructive dialogue. Fawaz downplays real issues by dismissing these concerns, impeding meaningful discussions on pressing matters.
Douglas itching to just
very
get in
quick,
there.
it's slightly off the topic, but it reiterates the point I was just trying to make, which is that an absence on one side creates something on the other. And this is a very good example. I said it for a long time. If your entire media says that Islamic extremism has nothing to do with Islam, you will create a movement that says it's all to do with Islam, and all Muslims must be involved. In the same way as if you pretend that no migrant into Europe is ever going to be anything other than the most brilliant PhD student, you will create a movement that says they're all terrorists. I mean, that is part of the problem.
Simon?
But how do you answer the problem? I'll come back to Clarissa's question. I mean, you've got a peculiar thing here. You've got a requirement which all intelligent liberal people say, which is to cover responsibly world events. There are lots of terrorist incidents in the Congo, in Uganda, or Nigeria, or Sudan. We just don't cover them. It's darkest Africa. We don't cover them. It doesn't matter how horrific they are. We don't cover them because we've got this thing, we cover terrorists. And terrorists is something that happens to us in our country, not in their country. Now, if we give terrorism what I still think is a ludicrously exaggerated extent of coverage, and I wouldn't go as far as you or Douglas in saying, you know, I want to show pictures of the dead bodies as well, in order to enrage the population even further.
We should, but yeah.
I mean, I just want to suppress that, because unless you suppress these sort of tabloid images, it's very difficult to get a conversation going about what is happening in Nigeria or Sudan or somewhere else. And I do come to a point which I never ever thought I would in my life, of saying that I just somehow think the concept of censorship, self-censorship, but censorship, has got to be part of this debate, and it has not become that yet.
Douglas returns with a thought-provoking point. One-sided arguments spawn opposition. Balanced viewpoints are crucial. Simon challenges this, shifting to media trends on global terrorism coverage. He advocates for recognizing terrorism beyond the West. Is there no solution to these complexities? Straying off topic, Simon stresses the need for balanced discussions on terrorism, urging for broader perspectives beyond Western-centric media coverage.
But let me ask you this then, Simon, quickly, and then I will open it up to the floor. But just this idea of, one thing we haven't touched on tonight is the idea that we all work in a business. It is a for-profit business, okay? And media is changing by the day. People go wherever they can for their information. It's not, no one buys, you know, the methods of consumption are changing, and people can go to where they want. They don't have to come to us. And I guess if we engage in the kind of self-censorship, or whatever you want to call it, because I do think you raise a lot of fair points, what if people stop reading the Times or stop watching CNN or stop? Because I guarantee you, if they're interested in reading about it and they want to know more about it and you're not covering it, they will change the channel or change the website.
Well, I mean, that's not an answer. There's a question.
Yes, that's why I'm the moderator and you're the panelist.
I don't think. I don't think the answer to the points we've been making is oh, you might lose money. I'm old-fashioned enough to think that journalism is actually about a certain sort of ethic, in which you try and find out what the truth is. You do not exaggerate the truth, you present the truth. You don't become a part of the story, you stand back from the story. All these things old as the hills. Always nagging at our shoulder is the Sun or the tabloids or Hearst or whoever it might Pulitzer. I mean, all these old gorillas. Always saying, oh, give us a better story, give us a better story. You make more money that way. The reason why I'm proud of journalism is for 100 years, enough journalists have said, I'm not going down that route. I'm going down the route which simply says what I think to be the correct way of looking at the world, and I'm going to go on doing that.
The host discusses journalists benefiting from terrorism reports. She questions Simon. Is avoiding taboo topics losing the audience? Simon defends ethical journalism, rejecting tragedy exploitation. However, sensationalized media content, including graphic footage, exists for profit. Responsible media consumption demands accuracy. Simon advocates for ethical journalism, prioritizing integrity over profit. The host now invites audience questions.
Let's start with you.
I wanted to just encourage you all to keep the word perspective in mind. I'm really with Simon on this, that I believe we've reached a train wreck confluence of media, politics, and money. A station like CNN has now found that it is economically viable for them, no matter what happens, one plane crash, one terrorist attack, to have 80 million panels that go on around the clock asking people their opinion. There are wildfires in Chile, there are deaths in Congo, there is Ebola, there are scientists working on things, and I really encourage you to just deliberately give equal weight to other stories. And the people who want to read about ISIS all day long will do so, but most of us won't.
Excellent point. Is there a question?
Do you agree?
No, it's a matter of encouraging you to keep doing what you're doing, but just don't give them the oxygen.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. The question tonight is whether does the media react to terrorist events? I would like to ask, is the real problem that geostrategic powers overreact to terrorist events? So, for example, one thing in this debate that I find very dangerous, we haven't mentioned terrorist attacks on India, for example. We forget after 9/11 there was an attack to destroy the Parliament of India, to try and wrench Kashmir out of the Indian state and start a civil war on the subcontinent. We have the Mumbai attack of 2009, which, though had a smaller death count than most of the wars of the 20th century, could have led to a war between Pakistan and India, which is the greatest location where nuclear exchange should take place. A war of vastly destructive potential could take place due to smaller events. In the Middle East, for example, are we seeing the disintegration of Syria and Iraq into its sectarian elements, and terrorism is a symptom of the problem and not actually causing the problem? So, for example, before 1914, the anarchists and their bombs could kill some thousands of people, but it was then the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand and then the overreaction by geopolitical powers that then caused the massive problem that we now have.
Okay, and another one?
I think it's clear that nobody is arguing for censorship. It's about restraint and against sensationalism. But if it's sensationalism, I would argue that, or ask, isn't that really a threat in terms of our reaction? Because it feeds an agenda, even here, of people who want to curtail civil liberties. But the real threat now is that there is someone in the United States behind the president who believes in chaos. I dread the next attack on the United States, which is bound to happen, because we really might see a genuine threat to democratic institutions given the people in power today. Isn't that a threat?
The woman urges for broad news coverage beyond terrorism, noting audience interest in diverse global news. The man criticizes the Western viewpoint, highlighting non-Western terrorism and geopolitical exploitation. Is the problem geopolitical powers exploiting terrorism? The second woman warns about sensationalism. The final question awaits before the host gives them to the panel.
Another good question, and I'll take one more and then I'll distribute these to the panel. Should we have one from the gallery? Yes, sorry.
I thought I was safe. I think we've talked about this a little. Simon, you referenced it. We are talking about terror through a lens of terrorism that happens to white Westerners. And Douglas, you asked the question earlier, like, how would we stop it? And I think the simple answer to how we stop it is that we do appear to stop it whenever it happens to Muslim people, brown people, black people. Look at what happened in Canada. And I know it's very easy for us all to say, nobody changed their Facebook profile to a Canadian flag and says, Je suis Canada. But we need to have that discussion. Why are we as the media complicit in not covering terrorism that happens to people of other faiths?
Okay, so I'm loving how many American voices I'm hearing tonight.
That's a rare
This is our night, ladies. Okay.
Do they merit equal attention? She emphasizes the bias in reporting based on victims' race or religion. The panel will discuss this crucial aspect, including biased vocabulary in news reports. Now let's hear the panel's perspective.
Let me start then by asking you, Simon, the first question, very interesting one. Is the real problem the media, or is it geopolitical powers that are overstating the terrorist threat for their own strategic purposes?
Well, firstly, I mean, terrorism is not new, but it's new in the sort of global sense that we're now experiencing it. We are completely obsessed with it. It's the dominant narrative of defense policy, for instance, which has nothing to do with terrorism, to my mind. Soldiers have seized on it. We can handle terrorism. Rubbish, and they just can't. So it is new in that sense. But it's not new in another sense. I mean, people have always been mesmerized by extreme violence. And people have employed extreme violence in order to get their message across. And to that extent, giving them what they want is what we've been doing. All I'm saying is that I think now it's of a different order. The fact that we don't cover certain terrorist incidents or certain terrible situations, which is not the same thing, is a different point. The point about terrorism is it depends upon the press. That's my point.
But I guess, you know, the gentleman who asked the question was also posing the idea of, are people like President Trump using the fear of terrorism or the threat of terrorism to try to push through their own agenda?
Well, I mean, this is one of the many reasons for not exaggerating the threat of terrorism. I mean, as the questioner here said, do you really want to allow a massive drive against civil liberty in the cause of somehow suppressing terrorism? They're not connected at all, but they're used within any society. There are elements in government that want to clamp down on things, and the clampers down have seized on terrorism. I mean, our own Home Office have seized on terrorism as a reason for clamping down on things. Now, that's giving into terrorism, if anything was.
Simon's disregard of terrorism's gravity overlooks its historical societal impact. While acknowledging violence's appeal, he underestimates today's terrorism menace. Douglas critiques media sensationalism, but Simon's view of terrorism as media-made falters. Terrorism's global ramifications exceed media influence, impacting lives universally. Governments leveraging terrorism for power raise concerns. Diminishing modern terrorism's threat is risky. How do we address terrorism's real dangers without undermining its importance?
Fawaz, I wonder if you might pick up on that, because I do think that relates to the second question from the woman who was talking about, her very real fears about President Trump, and I think there was a not so covert message, allusion to Steve Bannon there as well. But I wonder if the idea of sensationalism plays into this in a much more sinister and dangerous way, not from giving in to the terrorists or giving the terrorists what they want, but in this case to giving politicians perhaps what they want.
Thanks, Helen, for your question. I mean, to come back to Simon in his introduction has said, correctly so, that terrorism in terms of numbers, in terms of substantive casualties, even though every casualty matters, human life matters, it doesn't matter whether you're talking about, even though 6 individuals get killed in the United Kingdom and the United States every year, these are human beings, matter. But we're talking in terms of the institution of war. 6 people are 6 people, as opposed to 60,000 or 80,000 people. By the way, 85% of casualties of terrorism take place in 5 countries, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Nigeria, and Libya. So the overwhelming number of casualties, and we hardly tend to make the distinction. But to come back to the point Simon said, that the way we react, the way we respond, allow terrorists basically to win in terms of, first of all, we terrorize ourselves, we terrorize our public to a great deal as a result of our addiction to this particular coverage, and also undermine the democratic values. The democratic values, and that's exactly, what Osama bin Laden and Ayman Zawahiri and Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and all of them want. They want to undermine the democratic values. And let's come back to, Donald Trump. Donald Trump, during his campaign, he talked about a ban against Muslims, an ideology, collapsing terrorism with Muslims. That is, you're talking about 1.6. I'm not defending Muslims here, but you cannot collapse a limited phenomenon with a particular civilization. Again, playing into the hands of Al-Qaeda and ISIS and what have you. Again, another element of the question. Think of the way we covered, as you know, before the Paris attacks. There was a major attack in Beirut, in Western Beirut, in which 200 people were killed. It received hardly any attention.
I was there.
But hardly any attention in Beirut. I was in Beirut too. And there was a great deal of controversy. Why BBC and CNN does not really respond to an attack that killed hundreds of people were in Paris? Again, it tells you a great deal, but that's a different situation. But to come back to the central question, terrorism really, the way we react, the way we respond to terrorism basically has tremendous significance to the terrorists and also to the values. Not just Donald Trump. Populist movements throughout Western societies now are using and abusing terrorism. They're collapsing terrorism with migration, with refugees, with cultural entities in order to basically, for political ends, undermining the democratic values in Western societies.
Does the media's focus on sensationalism inadvertently fuel terrorist desires and politicians' agendas? Fawaz believes so, pointing out how public fear benefits both groups. This dynamic frequently leads to discord and division, as politicians exploit terrorism news to push their own ideas. As the discussion shifts to Douglas, how will he address this complex relationship between the media, terrorism, and politics?
And Douglas, the third question I thought was really interesting as well, because it touches on an issue that we haven't got into very much tonight, but because semantics matter, the very definition of this word terrorist that we bandy around so freely, but which I think means many different things to many different people, it has become synonymous with Islam somehow in the minds. It has been falsely collapsed, as you have said, in the minds of many people, to the point now where an American man goes and if he's white and takes an AK to his nearest shopping mall or goes into a African American church and kills 12 people, he's not called a terrorist. He's called deranged or disturbed or And I wonder, Douglas, if you have any thoughts on the idea of how we appropriate the sort of how we use this term terrorism and who we choose to call the victim of a terrorist attack and who is just the victim of a lone wolf. Or
if I may just make 2 points on this very quickly. One to the lady up there. I don't think we should beat ourselves up too much about the coverage of terrorist attacks that have a proximity to where we are. This always happens after a terrorist attack now. People say, why, as far as says, why have you got so much attention on Paris and less on Beirut? It's because Paris is Paris and Beirut is Beirut, and Paris is near us, and most people feel more kinship, and they've probably been to Paris, and more people have been there than they've been to Beirut. You can always play this game. It's regrettable, but it's not only us, in our country that feels like that. When something happens near you, it's of more import to you than if it happens far away. And sadly, the Middle East feels far away for most people. And so, of course, that's going to be the case. We might regret it, but it's not unnatural that's the way in which the things are covered. Secondly, on this thing, as it were, about motivation, there's another thing that happens now after any terrorist attack, which is it happened recently of what was it? There's a sort of graphics that gets sent around Facebook, social media, Twitter, all that kind of thing. You know, the number of people killed each year by, I don't know, lawnmowers versus the number killed by terrorists. You know, everyone has a great chuckle. You know, you're more likely to be killed by your toaster than you are by a, you know, and that also that also sort of skews the whole debate because, you know, I don't deny those stats in certain countries. By the way, they always tend to be, you know, things like how many people have been killed in America by terrorism since the 12th of September 2001? You know,
Six
that
people,
sort of thing. No, yeah, but the point is that this is so you go, you know, it always starts from a certain date that you know helps the statistic, as it were, because if you did it 24 hours earlier, you've got to put in 3,000 more people, and so on. Same with Paris; they don't pass around the Paris death toll statistics on the same amount because they're not as sort of giggly for a bit. But again, I know, like, I don't deny that a toaster can be dangerous or a lawnmower, but if there were a movement deliberately making dangerous toasters, you know, or deliberately miswiring lawnmowers to make sure they kill their owners, you know, I'd want to know about it, and so would you. And that's what we're dealing with, movements that actively want to do this. And so, of course, there's a disproportionate emphasis on that, because that's what matters.
Douglas faces a tough question on the link between terrorism and non-white individuals, notably Muslims. He criticizes the media's selective coverage and the dangerous oversimplification of this complex issue. Can a deeper understanding of the root causes behind this stereotype help combat such harmful associations? Douglas suggests it's time to delve deeper into why these connections persist. How will his insights shape the discussion?
First of all, you're absolutely correct. Proximity matters. Cultures matters, societies matters, nation matters. But the question on the table here is that the way we report on terrorist incidents color and influence public opinion. If we have a comprehensive, I'm not going to use the term objective, if we have a comprehensive and well-rounded coverage of terrorist incidents in the world, the public will get a particular, objective understanding that terrorism is not just, you're not the only one because you're blonde, Douglas, you're being attacked. Terrorism is a global phenomenon. Most of the victims are really Beirutis or Aleppo or what have you, point one. Point two, again, statistics matter, Douglas. Again, since we're worried about how ISIS and Al-Qaeda manipulate terrorism. So when we tell a British citizen here that the risk of being killed by a terrorist on an annual basis is 1.5 million per year, that your risk of being killed by a terrorist is 1 in 0.5 million. This matters.
Sure.
That is, there is, the risk is, there is a risk, but 1.5, where in the United States is 1.9 million. And so it matters. Final point on this one to come back. The reason why, Clarissa, the debate matters a great deal, because the people now, when I say populist movements and identity-driven movements, you're talking about people now who believe in the clash of civilizations. Stephen Bannon and the people around, the gang around our president, I'm an American, subscribe to the idea that there is a clash between the West and the rest is bloody Islam. And the whole idea, and this matters. So when he says, Trump, you're not reporting on terrorism, Clarissa, enough, he's saying to you, I want you to report on this, fault line, the Islamic fault line, the Muslim fault line, because he and the ideologues behind him and other people here in the heart of Europe subscribe to this notion there is a clash of civilization. There is no such thing. There is a clash within civilizations. ISIS and Al-Qaeda people, and I've spent really years, is about the war within. This is basically, it's a symptom, what we're witnessing here. And that's what we're not telling people.
Yeah.
This is a war within civilization. It's not about war between Islam and the West.
Fawaz aligns with Douglas on the media's focus, but highlights race and religion's influence on terrorism perceptions. He encourages broad coverage to debunk the notion that only whites are targets. While stressing statistical analysis, he overlooks the emotional toll of prominent attacks. Is Fawaz's rejection of the West versus rest view oversimplifying a sophisticated issue? How can his insights reshape the narrative on terrorism perception?
Okay, let me take some more questions because we've got so much good stuff we're talking about. Yes.
So I think it's unrealistic to ask media to stop covering terrorism in general, since way before this era of terrorism, if it bleeds, it leads, has kind of been the way journalists journalism has been acting. However, Simon did bring up a point in that terrorism is unique in that media themselves are implicated in the story. The question is, do you think that as a result, media should not be more self-reflective and actually bring this as part of the story to the public, that they themselves are a part of the story, and not educate the public on that role that they're playing, as well as educate the public on how they too could play a role by doing things like posting on social media and fanning the flames even further?
Okay, good question. Who? Oh, yes, sorry.
Hi there. Hi there. My question is, instead of talking about whether they should be deprived or not deprived, actually talk about what oxygen we're actually giving them. Because a lot of the words and terminology that we use, sometimes they're very unclear. For example, we use the word Islamic extremism. But what does Islamic extremism mean? I mean, somebody here might think, well, if it's Islamic extremism, it has to be something to do with Islam. On the other side, the terrorists are actually getting happy because they paradoxically, when you say Islamic terrorism to them, they think, oh, it has to do something with us, and so we have to retaliate, because they've got this paradoxical mind that if they talk about us, exclusively just about us, then it has to be something wrong with them, because they've already been brainwashed into thinking whatever they say is a conspiracy theory. And so when we sort of exclusively point them out instead of just saying that they're terrorists, they actually get fuel for that. So my question is it really about whether we should or shouldn't give them oxygen, and more about what oxygen are we actually giving them?
Mm-hmm. Okay. And
Yes, hello.
Oh.
Hi. To the extent,
Right.
to the
Yes.
extent that the media shows restraint, is there not a danger that social media will fill the vacuum, fill it with lies, and then the official media has got a decision? Does it now report on what the social media is saying, or does it still restrain itself? It's a very difficult trade-off. Where does the panel think that the line should be drawn?
Audience questions spark a deeper discussion. Can media transparency and public education alleviate the issue, as one woman suggests? Or is the heart of the matter defining the oxygen of this debate, as another man points out? As an elderly man questions whether mainstream media restraint, as advocated by Simon and Fawaz, might leave space for social media misinformation.
Simon, with the first question, which was directed to you, and this was an interesting idea. Should the media bring this whole question of media complicity or media's responsibility and media's role to the public and engage in a sort of dialogue about their role, the public's role? Is that a productive way of dealing with this conundrum somehow?
Well, I mean, yes, it sort of answers the last question as well, which is, and this is new, how do we handle social media?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, once we had a nice monopoly. I mean, the journalism profession and the big media organizations had it all their own way. Now we're being challenged by new means of communication, and we're in trouble, or we're regarded as being in trouble. I personally think editing is going to come back. Mm-hmm. I think they're going to be regulating the social media. Google and Facebook are going to be under huge pressure to moderate what they're doing. We're in a period of anarchy at the moment, so I think it'll change, and that'll answer some of these questions at least. But I mean, yes, whenever there's a horrific incident, I mean, I and other people usually write an article saying exactly the same thing. Please don't over-exaggerate the implications of this incident. Spitting in the wind, but I mean, at least you feel you're saying what you believe. And I don't know. I think that, I mean, I agree. Nothing's going to change. If it bleeds, it leads. On the other hand, and I come back to this point, there's a particular thing about a terrorist story which is unlike any other story. It is not like our normal stories where we're standing back and we're putting up a camera and witnessing something. We're actually a part of the story. And to that extent, the only way of handling it, I think, is as you suggest, to try and explain that we're part of this story. It's
not dissimilar, though, in the U.S. from mass shootings, where some reporters have elected not to give the names of people who perpetrate these, because it's, again, and we've had incidents where shooters have actually gone so far as to murder people on live television or on webcams to try to, and then you do have this incredibly uncomfortable relationship where the media is part of the story.
Well, I mean, I would like in these peculiar circumstances for there to be some sort of collective discussion as to how we ought to restrain ourselves. I don't care whether the word censorship. I mean, censorship is editing. I'm an editor. You're a censor.
Right.
That's not the point. The point is, how do we decide how we cover a story? Do we cover it ad nauseam, or do we cover it a little, or do we cover it just enough? What are the words we use to determine how we cover a story? This is the daily bread of newspapers. It's not the daily bread of social media yet, but I do believe it will one day be that.
Okay. Fawaz, the second question was about, is it less about giving them oxygen to breathe or what kind of oxygen we should be giving them? And talking specifically about this idea of Islamic terrorists as opposed to terrorists and whether that conflates the issues. And I guess I would just piggyback on with that question. Isn't terrorism already such a loaded word in terms of semantics?
Well, I mean, words matters. Not for our president.
Should journalists be transparent about their role in terrorist stories? Simon believes so. Acknowledging their influence on the narrative is crucial. They must report news objectively, while being mindful of how their perspectives shape the story. By engaging in open dialogue with the public, journalists can offer a more honest portrayal of events. This is vital in the fast-spreading social media age to prevent misinformation.
Okay. Fawaz, the second question was about, is it less about giving them oxygen to breathe or what kind of oxygen we should be giving them? And talking specifically about this idea of Islamic terrorists as opposed to terrorists and whether that conflates the issues. And I guess I would just piggyback on with that question. Isn't terrorism already such a loaded word in terms of semantics?
Well, I mean, words matters. Not for our president. They matter a great deal. For me, as an educator, I mean, the first thing we say, precision, facts, realities. For 8 years, Barack Obama never used the term, Islamic radicalism or
and
Islamic.
He was criticized heavily
very
for
much,
that.
and he lost the argument in the United States because he was basically portrayed as a weak president, a president that does not have really fire in the belly, that he, on and on, he really lost it in terms of public opinion. And Trump played on this very, very well. But again, to come back to what Trump and company are using now, Islamic radicalism, it's a code word. It's a code word in the eyes and ears of millions of Muslims. It means Muslims. He's collapsing, Muslim extremism. Why not call it Muslim extremism? What's wrong with this term? But to Bannon and to the ideologues behind the president, Islamic radicalism and Islamic terrorism basically connote the fact, because the term Islamic connotes civilization.
Do you think
we use the term Islamist. I use the term Islamist.
Sure.
Islamist is basically, we have invented a term which really doesn't mean anything. I use the term jihadism. Again, jihadism is a very loaded word because the institution of jihad is like the institution of just war in Christianity. That is, you can really activate the institution of jihad when you are faced with aggression.
But can I ask you first, do you think it would get better, as it were, in the Islamic world, for want of a better term, if you called it Muslim terrorism?
No, I mean, extremism.
Muslim extremism.
Because terrorism...
But what do you call it? Are you saying we should call it Muslim extremism?
Extremism, absolutely.
Or just extremism?
In the world of Islam, they use Muslim extremism. You have Christian extremists, you have Jewish extremists, you have black extremists, whatever. This is a neutral term. But the term Islamic in Islamic studies basically connotes a civilization. That is Islamic studies, Islamic culture, and here you're adding Islamic. That's how it's seen. And the reason why Barack Obama and his administration, because they were concerned about how basically the term resonates in the Muslim world.
I mean, this word terrorism, and someone said, what is terrorism? I mean, terrorism is a word for a method of violence. It's like a gun, okay? A Muslim gun, Muslim terrorism. The purpose of the gun that is terrorism is to gain publicity. That's my problem.
The question is that there is extremism. There's a great deal of extremism in the world of Islam today. We agree on that. I mean, and we can explain why there is a great deal of extremism in the world of Islam. And yes, Al-Qaeda and ISIS are an integral part of Muslim extremism. Why? Because they're using and abusing certain values and norms and doctrines in a very narrow, and we all talk about that. I mean, I highlight all that, these ISIS history. It's in paperback. It's just good.
All good bookshops. Yeah.
But I'm seriously. I worry again to reiterate when the President of the United States uses a loaded term, and this is the kind of oxygen. This is cultural overtones because that's exactly what, I mean, what they want to hear. They want to, in the eyes of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and the rest, basically they are defending the Islamic Ummah.
Is softening language when referring to Islamic terrorists justified? Fawaz argues for euphemistic terms like Muslim extremism, while Douglas Murray opposes this stance, advocating for naming the truth: Muslim terrorism. Fawaz's approach dilutes the severity of extremism, hiding its brutal reality. In contrast, Douglas urges for transparency and unvarnished honesty in addressing the issue of Islamic terrorism.
I worry again, to reiterate, when the President of the United States uses a loaded term, and this is the kind of oxygen, this is cultural overtones, because that's exactly what, I mean, what they want to hear. They want to, in the eyes of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and the rest, basically they are defending the Islamic Ummah. They are standing up against the decadent West, the aggressive colonial West. And what Donald Trump and company are saying, we hear you. We're also standing up for the West, and this is a kind of a clash of civilization.
Is avoiding the true nature of Islamic terrorism justified? Fawaz's reluctance to denounce it openly, under the guise of cultural sensitivity, potentially empowers extremists. By suggesting that condemning terrorism emboldens perpetrators, Fawaz enables and excuses their heinous acts. This is not a clash of civilizations, it's a battle against terrorism that demands clarity and unequivocal condemnation. Shying away from reality only aids the perpetrators.
Douglas, I want you to respond to that, but I wonder if you can do it also in the context of answering the gentleman's question, which was about this idea of we can editorialize and use this, nice bit of sophistry that kind of takes the edge off of things and makes us all feel quite happy with it. But are people then just going to go to social media where they can hear the real tough talk and, cut through the bull, as Americans would say?
Can I answer that first, if I may? We live in an extraordinarily perilous time in general with information in this regard at the moment. And let me give you two very quick examples that don't have directly to do with the thing we're discussing tonight, but which speak to it. The way in which you can now pump a lie or a rumor straight into the mainstream news is far more worrying than I think people are aware of. And let me give you two very quick examples. 18 months ago, when a Conservative Party donor who was disgruntled that he hadn't been given a place in the cabinet for his cash donations, releases a biography of the then Prime Minister, making the most lurid possible claim with no source that any newspaper in this country would stand up and publish on the back of, about something the Prime Minister was alleged to have done as an undergraduate at Oxford. Those of you who know, I'm not going to repeat it. But that was said in a book published by the author at the author's expense, the disgruntled former friend of the Prime Minister's. He managed to pump that claim directly into the system of the British press, and it was on the BBC and everywhere. Why? Because the papers know that if they don't repeat the allegation that is baseless and so on, it's all over the internet, and all their readers are going to go over the internet. Let me give you another example of that. A claim made before, or around the time of the recent election, after the election, before the inauguration of Donald Trump, about allegedly compromising information from the Russians. Without saying any speculation about where it comes from, again, a story which normally a newspaper would not be able to run because there's no source for it, there's nobody backing up the claim, is put into a website which then is so lurid that it goes all around the world. And before you know it, the Times of London is reporting the lurid thing that nobody ordinarily would pick up because it's on the net and they know that all of their readers are going to disappear onto the net otherwise. So if that can happen with these sort of grotty, innuendo stories, we have to consider how vulnerable we are in general to much more serious stories now. And I think that dividing line has become very, very dangerous. Just very quickly to respond to the...
Is our media landscape sacrificing accuracy for sensationalism, as Douglas Murray warns? The case of false accusations against David Cameron exemplifies this trend. Douglas's concern about falsehoods permeating mainstream media highlights the need for vigilant consumption and journalistic ethics. How can we trust a system prioritizing scandal over truth, even at the expense of tarnishing reputations? Maintaining integrity amid sensationalism is crucial.
Just very quickly to respond to the point about Fawad's about this, I'm a bit more sceptical than you are about this because, I mean, over 3 presidents now since 9/11, they've all taken a different tack and the response has pretty much been the same. Nobody likes to remember this, but what was the first thing that George W. Bush did as president after 9/11? He went to the Islamic Center in Washington, read his favorite bits of the Quran and insisted Islam is a peaceful religion, this has nothing to do with Islam. Okay, no, and everyone, of course, subsequently, you know, nobody gave him credit for it, but that was George W. Bush. Barack Obama refuses to say the term Islamic extremism when a man shouting Allahu Akbar at Fort Hood kills a dozen Marines. It was described famously as workplace violence. And so this thing comes up. What are they holding from us? Why are they lying to us? We can see what it is. Why are you not saying that the guy shouting Allah is greatest whilst gunning people down may be doing it for theological reasons? And you start to do the contrary thing. And that's why you now get, as I say, this situation. It's the same thing, as I say, with the migration, with European politics and all this stuff. The public aren't onto nothing when they're worried that the media is holding some of this stuff back from them. Barack Obama was berated at the UN by David Cameron for this. It was Cameron who said at the UN a year or so ago, you know, it's not enough that you say it has nothing to do with religion. You've got to admit it has to do something with religion in order to deal with it. But we are creating contrary forces all the time at the moment.
Excellent point.
Are leaders truly forthright about Islamic extremism, as Douglas Murray contends? He criticizes sugarcoating the issue and avoiding clear religious motivations behind violent acts. Murray demands honesty and accountability and condemns the creation of conflicting narratives in political discourse. This confronts the political doublespeak, hindering real solutions to extremist threats. The unequivocal demand for truth is a potent critique of misleading narratives.
Another round of questions. Sorry.
Hi there. Oh, sorry, should I wait on?
No, go for it.
Okay. This is really fascinating, so thank you. I was curious. We're obviously talking a lot about the media and whether or not we should, you know, talk about this or not talk about this, and where's the line and blah blah. And I wonder, you know, we're talking about the fact that you're really unlikely to be involved in a terrorist attack, and you were saying, you know, should we be asking them what they want instead? Is not talking about it the solution? Or, and what is? What is the solution?
Right.
Should we just not talk about it at all and it'll all go away?
Are we inflating our own importance in all of this maybe as well, and we could stop talking about it and it would still keep happening?
Probably just following on from that, are we financing terrorism by providing the oxygen of publicity?
Okay. And number 3, okay, yeah.
Hi, the Simon Jenkins position is incredibly plausible and a sort of desirable position for the educated elite, which was a phrase he used. But we here probably represent a vastly disproportionate proportion of the population at large. And my question for the panel is, are we not in danger of underestimating the reaction of the wider population that the educated elite is imposing some sort of self-censorship and therefore creating suspicion?
Excellent question. And if we can keep our answers a little brief, do you want to start with that one, Simon? Because you look sort of inspired to speak there. Are we out of touch?
I come back to something Douglas said. Because, I mean, I sense we are. Everyone thinks the moment they're passing through is some terrible crisis. And 50 years ago, everything was so easy and simple and straightforward and golden age. I'm not sure that's going to be true, but it is clear that the technology of social media, coupled with the particular phenomenon we're discussing tonight, terrorism, is producing a kind of critical mix, which we find very difficult to handle. I sort of believe, because I'm an optimist, that we'll sort it all out in the end. We'll muddle through, somehow it'll be okay. I don't know why I think that, but that's just my outlook on life.
But do you think we're out of touch? I mean, that's basically what we're hearing, that this whole conversation
Douglas' theory is if we don't sort of my subscript to what he's saying, if we don't cover terrorism big, people won't trust us anymore. And that's a worry. That would really worry me. And the reason why they may not trust us anymore, or the reason why their lack of trust matters, is they'll go to social media. So there are 2 or 3 new elements at play here. And I don't know the way through this. I just know that good, responsible media journalism ought to stick to its guns. It ought not to exaggerate, it ought to explain, it ought not to censor, it ought to explain, but it ought not to get frightened by the fact that irresponsible social media are doing other things. And I do think, as I said before, about Google and Facebook and all these other social media activities, I am convinced that within 10 years' time they'll be properly regulated in some sense. Okay. Now, that may be an undemocratic thing, it may be an elitist thing, I don't know. But I just think the degree of reckless irresponsibility you do see now with the social media will be brought under some sort of control.
Did Simon address the core issue of media responsibility adequately when questioned about terrorism coverage? The audience raised concerns about giving terrorists oxygen through publicity and the potential suspicion from self-censorship. Simon's vague response lacked a concrete solution, focusing on hopeful outcomes rather than media regulation. This non-committal stance reveals a disconnect from the urgency of media responsibility in covering terrorism.
Okay, Fawaz, do you want to take the question about are we financing terrorism?
How?
I guess the idea being, are we making money out of terrorism and giving terrorists publicity in the process?
I mean, we know, we think we know where the finances, for ISIS come from, multiple sources. Basically, most of it in the region, in the greater Middle East and the Islamic world, whether you're talking about oil in Iraq and Syria, or gas, or criminal networks, or donations from certain countries in the wealthy Gulf countries. Also, when Mosul fell to ISIS in the summer of 2014, tens of millions of dollars were basically hoarded by ISIS. And you're talking about ISIS also selling oil and gas to various networks in Iraq and Syria. And these operations, most of these attacks basically take very little. You're talking about really not hundreds of thousands of dollars, you're talking about tens of thousands of dollars. The big question, to come back to the oxygen is basically coverage, it's cultural, it's social, is inspiration, motivation, because that's what ISIS and Al-Qaeda want. They want to provide motivation and inspiration for the base. They want recruitment and what have you. Final point about, just come back to about Barack Obama and whether Barack Obama really refused to talk about Islam. In a major speech in the United Nations, Barack Obama made it very clear that there is a major problem in Muslim societies. He was on record by saying that this is a problem, and in fact, when he invited Muslim leaders, he made more than once. He basically addressed Muslim opinion makers and said that Muslim societies and Muslim opinion makers must address this particular challenge in Muslim societies. I mean, again, this is not being apologetic or even politically correct. Muslims are the main victims of this bloody thing.
Sure.
Muslim societies are basically have collapsed under the weight of extremism, authoritarianism, broken politics. I mean, people don't realize whether you're talking about ISIS or Al-Qaeda. ISIS and Al-Qaeda basically are a revolt against both the political establishment and the religious establishment in the Muslim world. There is not, in my book, by the way, I mentioned this, ISIS history. There is not, and this is on the record, there is not a single cleric, Douglas, a single cleric in the establishment in the Muslim world that has come in support of ISIS. Mm-hmm. Not even one. Can you imagine? A fact. Not even a single Muslim cleric from the establishment. In fact, I mean, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and ISIS, the revolt is against the establishment. Yeah. He has called in order to behead Muslim clerics. And again, when we talk about Islam, this is not to say that there are not major challenges, both in terms of institutional and cultural and what have you. But it's one thing to say that, another thing to say, the bloody 1 billion Muslims are responsible for this thing.
Is ISIS funding dependent solely on sources like oil, networks, and donations, or are deeper factors at play? Fawaz emphasized this, rejecting the collective blame on Muslims for terrorism. He condemned extremism, but noted the lack of support for ISIS among clerics. Echoing Murray, he emphasized individual responsibility and the need for nuanced discussions within Muslim communities. challenging simplistic narratives on terrorism.
They're not.
Okay.
We're all in agreement.
Question number 3, we're going to move on from this topic because we can spend all night on it, and it's a fascinating one. But I just want to get to the lady's question here, which is a really good question. Is not talking about it an answer? Are we somehow, in the same way that everyone said when Donald Trump finally came out and said radical Islamic terrorism and the world looked exactly the same as it did 5 minutes earlier, if we all just stop talking about it, is it going to make a difference?
No, and the rhetoric matters, but obviously it isn't everything, as the President is finding out. I mean, obviously you have to have a viable policy behind it. It's just that people are quite rightly worried that an absence of rhetoric, or at least apparent, unwillingness to get right into the weeds on it, is part of the problem. It just would suggest that you might not actually want to be grappling with it. It's like, I don't know, it's like when you speak to someone, you say, how would you deal with terrorism? They say something like, we've got to deal with poverty. And you think, oh, God, well, we'll do that one soon, I'm sure. And so, I mean, it's so vague as to be obviously meaningless. As I said, it's obviously, to my mind, not viable. I mean, you can't tell people not to worry about something that's very near them. And my own view is that for some time, Americans have been overheated about this. And I think Europeans have been slightly underheated on it, actually. But just very quickly, if I may, there is another reason we haven't touched on yet, but it is a market force within journalism which we haven't dealt with. In the same way that there was a period when the British police seemed to find it most useful to be on Twitter all day, and finding people who'd aired on Twitter, and people wondered why this was the case. And I was saying, well, it's obvious, isn't it? It's much nicer to do that than to go and find robbers and things. It's sort of more restful. In the same way, for journalists, it's much nicer to report this sort of the cycle than it is to go onto the ground and do the stuff and actually get people interested in stories which they didn't know that they would find interesting. I came back from northern Nigeria the other week where I was researching the massacres that are taking place there. And, there's not much interest in this country in Nigeria. But part of the reason is that the British press don't send journalists to these places. And so you get around to say, well, journalists don't want to read about Nigeria, And so it becomes all part of it very, very quickly. Another very interesting point of this phenomenon and the complexity of where we are in it. Look at what became the picture of the year at the Press Awards ceremony the other day. The photograph of the assassin of the Russian ambassador in Turkey standing over the body of a man who was who was alive only seconds before, standing over that. Now that was all over the press. And we had no problem with it. It was a dead Russian on the floor by a live, heated... and when you consider that the British press has no problem doing that, but absolutely, pardon my French, needed to change its trousers over reproducing a cartoon a few years earlier, you realise the sort of craziness that we're in.
Yeah.
You're taking your life in your hands if your publication publishes a cartoon, but everyone's got the dead body of the Russian everywhere.
Is avoiding open discussions on terrorism, as seen with Fawaz and Simon, a hindrance to solving the issue? Douglas Murray stresses the importance of confronting this topic directly. Evading it is akin to diverting attention from pressing concerns like poverty. Murray highlights media sensationalism over meaningful reporting on global events. It's crucial to face these realities courageously and without delay.
I'm going to have each of the panelists in a minute or less, please, beginning with you, Douglas. Just summarize your thoughts, and then we'll do another show of hands and see how you have all been...
I didn't just stop talking. I said everything I to say. I can't think of it. No. No, I would just say that I think there's a fair amount of agreement, honestly. I mean, I think we all recognise that journalists have to exercise a degree of restraint. And I think we recognise that there are times when journalists don't, and that we get it wrong. I think we're all in agreement on that. There is one element of this, by the way, which always troubles me, and you've got to be careful about how you say this. But I do think the extent to which the public behave on this also matters. The argument that journalists always use is, well, it's what the public wants, and then you miss the crucial thing of, well, the public aren't an entirely, sort of amorphous, collection of, well, I won't use it anyway. But insert. But the public. We are also moral beings, and we can draw our own lines on this. I just do think that, to an extent, we also all have to be aware of this. Do we click on the, do we Google, when you discover that somebody's emails have been hacked, do we Google for the hacked emails and then all have a great laugh about it? Because if we do on that, then we probably do on the other stories as well.
Good point. Fawaz, 1 minute or less?
I think probably, as Douglas said, we're not disagreeing a great deal. My take on it is that we need to give the context, we need to be proportional, we need to put the whole phenomenon in perspective, in comparative terms. We need to tell the audience, all of us, that this particular phenomenon has particular roots, that what we are seeing in the West here basically are reverberations of a great social and political evil in the Muslim world. And I think most importantly, we need to show resilience. It's amazing about I was in Beirut too during the attacks. What was it, 2015 or 16?
It was the day before Paris.
200 people were brutally killed by ISIS in West Beirut. 2 hours later, the city, took care of the dead, they buried the dead, and the city. 2 hours later, I went to the same place, back to normal. Of course, deep scars, but the city was able to show resilience, was able to. In Paris, I was there in Paris. The city was traumatized for 2-3 weeks. Paris, and again, the idea of resilience, the idea, and at the end of the day, I think we're very harsh on the media because we need to talk about the public. Fear is the greatest beast. And that's what, ISIS and Al-Qaeda traffic in fear. And in this particular sense, how do you restrain this particular beast? That's the question.
Is our society desensitized to ethical boundaries when we eagerly consume sensationalized news, as Douglas Murray highlights? Journalists often prioritize scandal over moral considerations, perpetuating fear for profit akin to ISIS tactics. Fawaz's inadequate response fails to address this core issue. How can we rein in this voracious fear-mongering beast? It's imperative to demand ethical journalism that prioritizes integrity over sensationalism.
Simon?
All we have to fear is fear itself. Yes. A famous phrase and unbelievably true. I have nothing much to add. We mustn't be afraid. They want us to be afraid. We mustn't be afraid. My worry is, and I think I do disagree with my colleagues here, I think it's a massive problem for the press. I just think we have got to find whole new forms of self-restraint, and we haven't shown it yet. And I don't know how we're going to do it, but I just think it's got to be done. And I don't think it's satisfactory to say, well, if we over-restrain ourselves, the social media will do it for us. It's like saying, I'm going to go and rob the bank because someone else will do it if I don't do it. That's not what we're about. The best solution, however, is not to go on talking about it. So let's go home.
Well, okay. On that note.
Is Simon's well-intentioned caution against fear missing the mark by underestimating the need for media self-restraint? Sensationalism must be curbed, not excused. Without stringent regulation, fear-inducing content will flourish, perpetuating anxiety. Relying on social media for boundaries evades responsibility. It's time for the media to uphold ethical standards, resisting external pressures. In the face of sensationalism, should we remain passive or demand change? In conclusion, Douglas makes some strong arguments about denying terrorists the oxygen of publicity. But we want to hear from you. Do you agree with him, or do you think the opposing arguments have some merit? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update from us.